Well, good evening, everyone. It's good to be back in Granbury again. Well, this evening, as you've heard, my topic is the Battle of Franklin. This may or may not be a name that you're familiar with, but there were several names there that I'm sure you are familiar with. The Confederate commander at the Battle of Franklin was John Bell Hood, and among his officers there, commanding some of his troops, was Patrick R. Cleburne, after whom Cleburne, Texas is named, and also Brigadier General Hiram B. Granbury, after whom this town is named. And this is a battle that came late in the war. It happened on the last day of November of 1864. Now, as students of history, you all know that the war continued. Actually, the major fighting ended with the surrender of the Army of Northern Virginia at Appomattox in April of 1865. Now that's, 4.5 months after the Battle of Franklin. So in some ways, you might think, well, Franklin doesn't sound like it's so late in the war. But I would argue, and I do argue in all of my books, that the Civil War was decided militarily in the area west of the Appalachians, between the Appalachians and the Mississippi River, that the action that decided the outcome of the war happened there. And the Battle of Franklin is part of the sort of final flurry of fighting there that kind of closed the book on the fighting west of the Appalachians. Now, when I say that it was decided west of the Appalachians, and you're thinking, well, how can that be? Because it really ended when Lee surrendered at Appomattox. Well, think about this. The main Union armies from west of the Appalachians, now what we're going to run into at Franklin is going to be really a sort of a side detachment of the Union Western armies. But think where the main Union armies from west of the Appalachians, the armies that had fought west of the Appalachians, where were they when Lee surrendered at Appomattox? The answer was they were in the northern part of North Carolina, marching north into Virginia from the south. They were coming up behind Lee. So really, that final play there in Virginia is not in doubt at all, when you've got the Union armies from the west are then closing in on Lee from behind. So how does that happen? Well, we're going to, as I say, I'm going to talk about the sort of the final flurry of the Confederacy's efforts to hang on to the area between the Appalachians and the Mississippi. Now, during the summer of 1864, the big thing that was going on west of the Appalachians, depends how you define Appalachians, by the way. You could almost define this as east of, but we won't quibble about that. But the big thing that was going on in the Western theater was the Atlanta Campaign. And it lasted from May of 64 until the beginning of September of 1864. And during that time, William Tecumseh Sherman's army advanced. This was not the march to the sea. This was combat, heavy combat throughout that period from May until September of 64. And gradually Sherman's army drove closer and closer to Atlanta, opposed by a Confederate army that was at first under the command of General Joseph E. Johnston. And after Johnston was removed for failing to stop Sherman, then that army was under the command of John Bell Hood. And they fought a number of battles around Atlanta. That's not part of our story for tonight. It's just sort of a prologue. But Hood delayed Sherman from getting into Atlanta for a number of weeks, but finally he couldn't postpone the fall of the city any further about the 1st of September, and Sherman took Atlanta. Now that was significant in a number of ways. Atlanta was very important to the Confederacy as a transportation hub, but also as a major city, and it was important because the Union was holding an election that November. It was November of 64. Lincoln was up for re-election. Now, if Lincoln had lost the election, it's not a guarantee that the Confederacy would have won its independence. But it's certain that the best chance the Confederacy had by that time would have been Lincoln losing the election in November of 64. It wasn't a guarantee, it wasn't a lock, but that was the best chance they had. Early November, as our elections are also nowadays. And what happened during those summer months was that Union morale got very low. They got very discouraged. The Union populace could not see that their generals were making any real progress. Now, the fact was they were. Both Grant and Sherman were steadily making progress, tightening the noose around the Confederacy, but the Northern populace couldn't see that. There wasn't anything tangible. There weren't big cities falling or major battles that were clear, decisive victories. And so the Northern populace got very discouraged because while they couldn't see clear and dramatic victories, they could see long and growing casualty lists. And by late August, Lincoln believed that he was going to lose the election. And again, that was the Confederacy's last best hope of winning its independence. Of course, we don't know what would have happened. We're never told what would have happened, are we? But if they had a chance, that was it. And Lincoln thought it was going to happen. Lincoln was a pretty good politician. He had a pretty good feel for the political, lay of the land. In those days, of course, they didn't have any polls for whatever those might be worth, but they didn't have them to tell them who was going to win. So Lincoln's guess was as good as a guess, I think, as anybody's, and he thought he was going to lose. That was late August. And then, of course, right after the 1st of September, Sherman took Atlanta. And that was exactly the dramatic victory, the tangible, obvious, clear, recognizable win that the Northern populace had needed. And after that, it was pretty certain that Lincoln was going to be reelected. And as the weeks passed between the 1st of September and the election in early November, it became more and more obvious that Lincoln was going to be reelected. And indeed, as we know, he was. And after that point, the Confederacy really didn't have much of a chance left anymore. It's hard to imagine, even if we go all counterfactual, and what if this would have happened, and what if that would have happened, it's hard to imagine any sequence of events, short of the Confederacy using a thermonuclear device, that would have possibly given Confederate victory after Lincoln was reelected. The Confederacy would have had to have hung on for at least 2 and maybe 4 more years, and it wasn't close to being able to do that. So what do you do when you're a Confederate general and the war is going on? Your government, your commander-in-chief says, fight on, we're not giving up. But strategically, it's awfully hard to see how you could really win. I guess you try desperate things. In football, when it comes down to the end, you try a Hail Mary pass. They usually don't work. Of course, at the end of the first half, Saturday, that was pretty cool. We're going to have our hands full on this Saturday. That's a scary game coming up there for Frog fans. But anyway, sometimes they work, but they usually don't. And of course, what do you do when it's the last play of the game and you're down by 21 and you try a Hail Mary pass? I guess you do. Why not? The thing is, in football, if you try the Hail Mary pass and the ball falls on the grass or the wrong guy catches it, it was really the last play of the game, well, you really haven't lost anything. You had nothing to lose. But in war, well, we're going to see. There was something to lose, and they did. After the fall of Atlanta, then, but before Lincoln's reelection, Hood tried something new. And it wasn't necessarily a bad idea. In fact, it was probably the best idea he could have tried. Atlanta's gone. He can't do anything about that. He can't take it back. He doesn't have enough troops. But he took his army and he moved west. And he moved into Alabama and a little north of Atlanta and over just west of the Alabama line. And what he did is from there, he would march into Georgia and he would try to hit the railroad between Atlanta and Chattanooga. And that railroad was Sherman's supply line. Now, sometimes we think about wars in the past, we think about the Civil War. And we don't think that much about supplies, but armies had to have supplies. You couldn't just go down to the Winn-Dixie and buy everything you needed. There wasn't a Winn-Dixie, and you would have bought them out anyway, and you couldn't do that. Even if you cleaned out all the food in the neighborhood, it wouldn't be enough to keep your army eating, and you needed a steady supply of food. And generals had to think all the time about being near some means of transportation, which usually meant a river, an ocean, or a railroad that would bring them food. That, or be marching through the enemy's country and keep moving. Stay spread out and keep moving. And that was the only way you could keep your army fed. So it was a serious threat to Sherman when Hood began to threaten that railroad and try to cut the railroad. And so Sherman had to turn back with most of his army, leave a garrison in Atlanta, turn back with most of his army, and try to chase Hood off the railroad. And that's what they did for about the whole month of October of 1864. So between the fall of Atlanta and the election, the main action going on out there was that Hood was chasing after Sherman's railroad, and Sherman was chasing after Hood. Well, by the end of October, Hood had become very frustrated that he could not catch and break Sherman's railroad. And the railroad was not going anywhere, but he couldn't get at it. Sherman was always turning back and chasing him off the rail line, and Hood had to retreat. Sherman was very frustrated and aggravated that he couldn't get Hood. He couldn't trap Hood and destroy his army. Sherman couldn't destroy Hood's army. Hood couldn't destroy Sherman's supply line. And by about the 1st of November, last of October, both generals had gotten so frustrated that they were ready to be done with this. They weren't going to do it anymore. And so we see this strange phenomenon, and I'm not sure if you can point to a single other case in all of military history of this or any other country where you see this, where two opposing armies turn away from each other and march in opposite directions. Not retreating, but actually both of them headed into the enemy's country. Both generals kind of came to this conclusion at the same time. Not getting anywhere with what I'm doing, it's time to stop it and do something else. Sherman decided to turn and march southeast towards Savannah and the sea. And this is the famous March Through the Sea. That's a whole other story for maybe another day, another time. But Hood really could not pursue Sherman, even if he hadn't already gotten another idea. You think, well, what if Hood would have chased after Sherman? He couldn't really do that. Now, if he could have, it would have been a big problem for Sherman, because, again, in order to keep his army fed, Sherman would have to keep spread out and keep moving. In order to fight Hood, he would have had to stop and pull his troops together. Now, those are opposite things. So Sherman would have had a problem if Hood would have been in the neighborhood, but Hood couldn't be. Because by this time, Hood had, in a sense, run himself out of the play. He had, by moving west into Alabama, he was in a position where he would be way behind Sherman and really wouldn't be able to catch up or get close to him until Sherman got to the coast. Also, if Hood traveled directly behind Sherman, he would be traveling over land where Sherman's men had already eaten up the supplies, and there wouldn't be much for Hood's men to eat. So that wasn't going to work, even if Hood had wanted to try it. And Hood never thought about trying it. He had his own idea. He wanted to go north. So what he had been doing while Sherman was getting ready to set out from Atlanta and go southeast toward the sea, towards Savannah, Hood was moving his army west. And he crossed over to the north side of the Tennessee River, near Decatur, Alabama, and he marched north from there. Hood wanted to march into Tennessee. Now, what did the Yankees have there to stop him? Well, Sherman had known that Hood had the potential, and in fact, it looked like Hood probably was going to do something like that. So what Sherman had done is he had detached a part of his army under General George H. Thomas and had sent them back into Tennessee. Now, Thomas didn't have as many troops with him as Hood did. Hood had in his army at this time about 40,000 men. Thomas had about 27,000 men. But more troops were on the way to Thomas. There was a large detachment that had been recently operating in Missouri, and they had been put on steamboats, and they were being shipped to Nashville. They were going to reinforce Thomas, and there were other bodies of Union troops that had been holding various positions in Tennessee, and they were going to be coming together. They were on their way, and when they all got together, Thomas was going to have about 60,000 men. And Grant had figured that would be enough to deal with Hood, and it turned out he was right. Plot spoiler, oh boy. I hate to give it away who won, but I'm afraid the Yankees are going to win again. But anyway, Grant figured that 60,000 ought to be enough to take care of John Bell Hood and his people. But they weren't all there. Now for Hood, the name of the game was to get to Thomas, to get to those Union troops before they came together, to get to them while they were separated, and then he could defeat them separately. There was a term for this in military parlance. It was called defeating the enemy in detail. You defeat the separated segments of the enemy force. You see, Hood and his 40,000 men would be more than enough to defeat 60,000 Yankees if they got them in separated groups. And that was what Hood wanted to do. So maybe he just had a chance. He was going to have to move fast, and there wouldn't be any margin for error. And one big question is, even if he could do that, could he change the outcome of the war? And that's questionable. We don't know. He sure could have made big headaches. And Grant was, of course, over by Petersburg in Virginia, and of course he's following this all via telegraph reports, and he was seriously concerned. And he kept sending telegraph reports to Thomas, you need to take care of Hood. Grant was afraid that Hood would actually just slip past Thomas and go all the way to the Ohio River. And in fact, Hood was thinking about going that far, but Hood wanted to defeat Thomas first. And then what Hood had in mind, what's Hood's play for winning the war? Hood's win the war plan. We defeat Thomas by catching his army in pieces and defeating the various parts. And then we're going to go north to the Ohio River and maybe cross it into Ohio. Why not? In December? You know, if you listen carefully to my accent, or my lack of an accent as the case may be, you may gather I know something about Ohio in the wintertime. Matter of fact, I do. And it's cold. And I've never been tempted to go barefoot in Ohio in the wintertime. Haven't been all that tempted in Texas either. But anyway, it is seriously cold up there. But that was Hood's plan. We're going to go through Ohio. We're going to march into Pennsylvania. And that'd be interesting, crossing the mountains. Yeah, we'll figure a way to do it. We'll figure that out. And then we're going to join Lee and defeat Grant, win the war. That's how it goes. That's a bold plan. Well, yeah, I was going to make a football. My students, I guess I'm fairly well known for making football analogies in my lectures, but I have to be careful which teams. You know, on TCU campus, there are certain teams I can always insult, and we love to hear that, but who knows who might be represented here, so I don't want to insult your favorite team, even if they wear green. But we feel very, very sorry for them. Oh, yeah, we all have our ups and downs, and we've had our down times too. Anyway, the point is, it was a pretty bold plan. Some would say it was not too realistic, but anyway, phase one, catch Thomas's army and defeat it before it could come together. Now, Thomas personally went back to Nashville. That's where he planned to gather his troops. And he left his 27,000 men under the command of his subordinate, General Schofield, in south central Tennessee, near Pulaski, Tennessee. Well, Hood moves north. He crosses the Alabama-Tennessee line west of General Schofield. Schofield realizes at once that he's not going to be able to hold the line there near Pulaski, Tennessee, which is right in the southern part of Tennessee. So Schofield fell back. He fell back to Columbia, Tennessee. That's on the Duck River. It's about halfway between Nashville and the Alabama line. And kind of in between Nashville. If you were headed straight south out of Nashville, headed for Alabama, the shortest way, why you might go through Columbia. Probably would, actually. And because that's probably where the highway goes. But anyway, Schofield fell back to Columbia to see if he could maybe stop Hood there. Now, what's Schofield supposed to be doing? Just sitting out down there waiting for Hood to come and destroy him? Well, as far as Hood's concerned, that looks like a pretty good idea. But no, as far as Schofield was concerned, what he's supposed to be doing is slowing Hood down. Right? He's supposed to make Hood go slower so that Hood doesn't get to Nashville before Thomas gets his whole force together there to defeat Hood. So that's what Schofield's supposed to be doing. He's not having a lot of luck doing it, actually. Hood had gone right around him, and he had to fall back to Columbia. Hood makes plans now to go around Schofield again. Go around, now he's going to go the other direction. Hood's going to move to his right, Schofield's left. He's going to shift to the east and cross the Duck River a few miles east of Columbia, Tennessee, get around on the other side. And then he's aiming for a town on the highway there, was such as it was, the Pike, about halfway between Columbia and Franklin. And that little town, halfway between Columbia and Franklin, was called Spring Hill. And it was on the Pike there. And if Hood could get his army there, he would not only have gone around Schofield, he would not only not have allowed Schofield to slow him down, he would have Schofield pretty well trapped. That highway was Schofield's route of escape. You might say, well, couldn't Schofield use back roads to try to get away? Maybe. That was a very questionable proposition. When you think about it, if somebody's trapping you there and you're going to use the back roads and you don't know where they are and you get into some road that doesn't go through and you find yourself, for example, on Highway 377 practically anywhere, and they've got construction. It's been there for like 20 years. I live in Benbrook now. It's awful. Oh my. Well, you got to understand. I mean, you can't get kickbacks if you don't keep the highway project going all the time. Well, that's okay. We have the finest government in Benbrook that money can buy. But anyway, it's kind of like Congress. But anyway, he's going to trap Schofield if he can. He's in a pretty fair way to do it. So he makes a plan, and they start out really early in the morning. Hood's right there in the saddle, by the way. Now, you know, John Bell Hood has had a rough war. At Gettysburg, he took a shell fragment in the arm. They saved his arm, but he really lost the use of it. That arm was not really much use for anything after that. Then he was back on duty just a couple of months later. He was at Chickamauga. That was in September of '63. So now a little more than a year prior to our events that we're talking about tonight. And he took a Minié ball, one of those big 58 caliber soft lead slugs, right in his thigh. And it hit the bone. And when one of those things hit a bone in those days, even a modern surgeon would be hard put to save that bone because it shatters the bone. It just splinters it. Maybe they could nowadays. They do amazing things. They sure couldn't back then. And the best treatment the surgeon could do for you was to get out his bone saw. And so Hood had had his leg amputated just below the hip. Actually, the report went around in the days immediately following that Hood had been killed. But he didn't. He recovered and was back on duty then in the spring of '64, wearing a wooden leg. Had a prosthetic leg. Of course, their prosthetics were not nearly as advanced as ours are today. And in order to ride, he had to be strapped in the saddle. Now, he could do that, but historians have argued about just how easy that was for him. During the battles around Atlanta, you kind of get the feeling that it was not necessarily just the easiest thing in the world for Hood to go and hop on a horse, as it used to be. Hood here is 36 years old. He's not an old guy at all. And it used to be quite an athletic guy. He used to be a cavalryman. So hopping on a horse, just jump on a horse and go gallop off and see what's going on at the front, that was nothing. Well, there was something now when you had to have help getting up on the horse, and then you had to be strapped into the saddle. Also, I would theorize that riding a horse when you're strapped in the saddle is going to be more fatiguing physically with only one leg than would be the case if you had two legs. I'm nobody's idea of a horseman, but I do know that you're supposed to sort of go up and down with the horse. And You don't do it like I do it when I have been on a horse for 40 years, and that's a good thing for me and the horse. But and I think that would be just harder. I think it would be harder to do that on one leg, and I think it would tire you more. And I think Hood was very tired by the end of that day. That's November 29th, when they went around the Yankees there at the Duck River and got to Spring Hill. It was a long march, an eventful march. Hood, as I say, rode with his troops there. Along with the column, I've already mentioned that Claiborne was there. It's spelled the same, by the way, but as the name of a town in Texas, it's pronounced Cleburne, I think. And as the name of a general in the Confederate Army, it was pronounced Claiborne, even though it's spelled the same way. But Claiborne was with them, and he was an excellent division commander in Hood's army. Some people think he was the best division commander on either side in the whole war. That's going pretty far, but it may actually be true. He was very, very good. Claiborne had been born in Ireland in 1838 and had actually served as a very young man in the British Army. He had applied for admission to med school and got turned down. They're in Dublin. So he signed up and served in the 41st Regiment of Foot. And I think he rose to the rank of corporal, and then he bought his discharge, and he came to America, and he settled in Arkansas. And turned out to be a very, very good officer. That particular day, as far as what Claiborne saw, as they passed through Columbia, Schofield's guys had retreated already. They were on the road, headed north. The question is, could they get away? As they passed through Columbia, they passed by, or near Columbia, actually not really in the town, but outside Columbia near Ashland, Tennessee, they passed by a brick church building. It was called St. John's Episcopal Church. A late general of the Confederate Army, Leonidas Polk, who had died that summer, killed in action, but he had previously been an Episcopal bishop. And he and his three brothers, I think it was three brothers, anyway, brothers, however many they were, had actually had that church building built there on the property, right next to the property of one of his brothers there near Columbia, Tennessee. It was St. John's Episcopal Church, and it's very nice. You can easily find a picture of it on the web. Google search it, St. John's Episcopal Church, Ashland, Tennessee, or Columbia, Tennessee. And it's quite pretty. And it was very much in the English style. Of course, it's an Episcopal church, so you want to do it in the English style. And it was there, and it had nice grounds around it, shade, trees, and a nice cemetery out there. Very nice. And Claiborne stopped and looked at it, and he told an aide who was riding with him, he said it reminded him of churches in the old country, back in Ireland, where he grew up. And he made a comment. And you know, when the lecturer tells you that a guy says a thing like this, it's ominous here. It's like a guy in a red shirt being down on a planet at the beginning of a Star Trek show. I don't know if y'all or any of you were Star Trek fans and you know what that means, but it's kind of grim. But anyway, Claiborne said, it would be almost worth dying to be buried in such a beautiful place. File that one away. Well, they continue to move north. Claiborne with his division. Granbury was a brigade commander in Claiborne's division. There were several, I think 3 brigades in Claiborne's division, and Granbury commanded one of those brigades, Granbury's Texas Brigade. And they're following along, and then Hood is riding at another part of the column, and they get to Spring Hill. And most of Schofield's army has not passed by Spring Hill yet. And the Confederate Army halts as darkness is falling. Of course, it's November 29th. It's not going to stay light very late. Sundown came around 4:36 on that day. So pretty early. It's getting dark, and the Confederate Army halts within a couple of hundred yards of the turnpike there, the pike as they called it, just south of Spring Hill. They had the opportunity actually to move in and take Spring Hill itself. They skirmished with some light Union forces that were holding it, but they didn't press on. There was a little confusion about orders, who ordered who to do what, who ordered whom to do what, who was actually supposed to move in there versus who else. so none of them took it. But of course, they were within a couple hundred yards of the pike south of town, and you can't march an army right by on a road 200 yards in front of another army, can you? Actually, you can, it turned out. They did. Schofield's men, about half of Schofield's army was still to pass that point, and they actually did it in the dark that night. They marched along the pike a couple of hundred yards from where Hood's army was. Some of the Union soldiers in the column actually didn't realize their situation. A lot of them did, and they were keeping quiet, but some of them didn't know, saw campfires across the way, thought maybe they'd go over there and chat with those guys, warm up some coffee. I wonder what unit is camped over there anyway. I didn't realize we had any people camped over there. We didn't. And they actually were taken prisoner. And you would think that that would have told the Confederates that there are Yankees here. They knew it, but of course they didn't have any orders to go forward and take the pike. So they didn't. And Cleburne's men, Schofield's men got away. They just marched away. I mean, a few dozen of them were taken prisoner, but Schofield's whole army got away. What was Hood doing during this time? Well, he went to bed early. He was very tired. And of course, I can understand. He's been riding a horse all day, and he's got this. And remember, he had a leg amputated about 14 months earlier. And that alone has got to sap your stamina, having a leg amputated. And then he's been riding all day. And that may be enough to explain it. He didn't really follow up. Somebody came and reported in. He was asleep fairly early in the evening, and somebody came and reported to him, General, this is the situation, what should we do? And oh, well, General so-and-so will take care of it. And the General so-and-so didn't take care of it. Hood had gone back to sleep, and nothing had happened. Now, it is interesting, the previous summer, when Jefferson Davis was thinking about giving Hood command of that army, Davis had asked Robert E. Lee, who had known Hood from the time Hood was a cadet at West Point, and Lee was commandant of cadets. And then Hood had served in Lee's army after that during the early part of the Civil War. And Davis had written to Lee and said, what do you think about John Bell Hood? And Davis had said, well, you know, Hood's very brave. He's very diligent on the battlefield, but not so much off the battlefield. Slight paraphrase there, but close to those words. That Hood, you know, you get him on a battlefield and he's really a hard driver, but he's not real good about taking pains to prepare. By the way, it's a strong contrast to Patrick Cleburne, who was just renowned for careful preparation. As much as he could, as much time as you would give him, he would prepare for operations. Hood, not so much. And so the Yankees got away. The next morning, Hood got up, either perfectly calm or wrathy as a rattlesnake, depending on who you believe. There are different accounts out there. And this is where I get into the whole issue of how controversial John Bell Hood has become. Now, back in 1990, when my book, Jefferson Davis and His Generals, came out, wow, 27 years ago. You know what that means, don't you? That means I'm getting old. But back when that book came out, I was considered quite a strong defender of John Bell Hood. I was his big, defender, supposedly. And I know another guy, a younger guy who has written a book on Hood, said he was inspired to write that book presenting a positive case for Hood by reading Jefferson Davis and His Generals. The thing is now, I guess I started something. I don't know that I really started it. But now Hood has quite favorable press. And there have been some very favorable books written about Hood in recent times. My friend Steve Davis of Atlanta, one of the nicest guys you'll ever meet who wears a bow tie. He's just marches the beat of a different drummer. He really is a good guy. But he's written a very favorable interpretation of the Atlantic Campaign for Hood. And then a sort of a collateral descendant of Hood's, named Sam Hood, has written a very favorable book about Hood and kind of attacking him. So I find myself now kind of being attacked for not being favorable enough to Hood, but then I haven't really published much about him in the last 27 years. So was Hood angry or was he not? And why was he not reactive during the night. I think now probably it's a good enough explanation to say he was very tired and he was not the kind of guy, as Robert E. Lee said, to be diligent off the battle. I'll take Robert E. Lee's word for that. He knew John Bell Hood, and Hood was not the kind of guy to be diligent off the battlefield. I know also that Hood must have been very tired. I think that's a good enough explanation. Now, a number of years ago, actually more than 27 years ago, Richard McMurray, who's also a good guy, but he had written a book in which he speculated that Hood may have been taking a derivative of opium called laudanum for the pain from the stump of his leg, and that may have explained some lapses in judgment and lapses in activity by Hood. Was Hood on drugs? Well, as Steve Davis has pointed out, and taking me to task for citing McMurray in my footnotes, and saying that Hood was using laudanum, and I cited McMurray, and Davis says, yeah, but McMurray can't prove it. He doesn't really have any evidence. Okay. So I'll have to admit, that's true. There really isn't any hard evidence. There's no primary source evidence that Hood was on drugs at all, unless you count what he did at Franklin as evidence that he was on drugs. But no, we have to explain it some other way. I think we can't really go there. I think we can't make the claim that he was on laudanum. He was just tired at the night at Spring Hill, and what else was going on is a good question. Then the whole argument, was he angry or was he not? Scholars earlier tended to say he was angry. They quoted another general as saying he was wrathy as a rattlesnake. More recent scholars tend to say, no, he was in a perfectly equable mood. He was feeling fine. It's a beautiful day in the neighborhood. Yeah, okay, it's just Mr. Rogers here, all happy and nice. Well, I don't know. But I think he was somewhat unhappy, and he did scold some of his generals, including Claiborne and some of the others, rather harshly for letting the Yankees get away. And he set out after them. He set out in pursuit. And so they went further up the pike from Spring Hill, and about 1 o'clock in the afternoon, they reached the vicinity of Franklin. And on the pike, where Franklin comes into view, is when you go over a hill on the pike called Winstead Hill. And you're a couple of miles from Franklin at that time. Well, okay, now you're practically in Franklin on Winstead Hill. But then you were a couple of miles from Franklin, from the edge of Franklin. In front of you at the foot of Winstead Hill is an open plain, very gently rising, if at all, really. I'd almost say it's just level. You couldn't prove by me that it rises or falls. It's just level. This level plain, and then going to the Union lines. Yes, the Union had lines around Franklin. When Schofield had arrived in Franklin earlier that morning, in fact, Schofield's first troops, the ones in the lead, the ones who had not been in a position to get cut off at Spring Hill, they had actually reached Franklin before dawn, and they had been preparing. The problem at Franklin was the Harpeth River ran just on the other side of Franklin. And the Harpeth River, there was a ford, but it was difficult to get things and people across at that ford. It was going to be very slow getting the army across at the ford, and it was very plain they were not going to be able to get their army across the ford at the Harpeth before Hood hit them. So they had a problem here. There had been bridges at Franklin, but they had been destroyed. Schofield had a pontoon bridge train, a pontoon bridge sort of set that he dragged with him on wagons, but he had to leave them behind in order to get out of Columbia. So he couldn't get across the Harpeth River, at least not fast enough to get away from Hood. He was going to have to turn at bay and try to defend himself there at Franklin. Now, there had been a fight at Franklin about a year before. It was a small battle. It didn't amount to much. But the Union troops at that time had dug trenches, or breastworks, actually. It's more than just a ditch in the ground. A ditch technically is not a trench. But it's more than just a trench. But what you've got is fence rails and logs piled up and covered with earth. You've probably got a 2 or 3 foot deep trench behind that, as they called it, breastwork. The breastwork's probably going to have a headlog on it with a slot underneath that they can fire through. And then in front of the entrenchment, you've got actually what is technically called a ditch. And that's to make your enemy have to go down into that ditch and then climb up your breastwork, and you have to go farther up without making your breastwork have to be so high that it sticks up and it collects cannonballs from, it can get hit really easy by cannons. So they had built something like this already. It wasn't really big enough for Schofield's army, and it wasn't really complete. But the first of Schofield's troops that got there before dawn that morning had set to where they had realized, Schofield had realized, we're not going to get out of here before Hood hits us. We got to be ready. So they had started to strengthen those breastworks or entrenchments, and they started to dig in more. And then by noon, an hour before Hood had reached the top of Winstead Hill and could look down on the town of Franklin and that open plain in front of it, and the Union Army drawn up along the edge of it there, about an hour before that, they were finished with those breastworks. They were ready to go. And Schofield had pretty much his whole army there, in those breastworks, with the exception of one division I'm going to tell you about in a minute. But anyway, Hood decided that the thing to do was to attack. He decided they haven't had very long to build those entrenchments. He didn't know they had a head start. I don't think he realized how soon they had gotten there. Maybe he was angry. Some would deny this. Maybe he wanted to teach his army that you really can assault people and defeat them. He had complained in some of his letters that summer that his men were reluctant to attack breastworks, earthworks, an entrenched enemy. See, we usually figure today that during the Civil War, one soldier behind entrenchments was equal to 3 soldiers out there trying to attack him. And so soldiers had learned to respect entrenchments. Attacking entrenchments was a good way to get killed. So they were very skittish about that, and Hood had complained in letters that summer, the Army's they're not eager enough to attack. So it might be that he wanted, they need to learn. They can attack entrenchments and win. After all, Hood had first gained his fame in the Civil War by breaking the Union line in an entrenched position at Gaines' Mill. Anyway, he ordered an attack. Now, he didn't even have his whole army up yet. His army consisted of 3 corps, and one of those corps was still miles back down the road. They had been sort of faking at Schofield from head on across the Duck River at Columbia, and they had not been able to start their march north until Schofield had retreated, so they were several hours behind. So 1/3 of Hood's infantry wasn't even there. Almost all of Hood's artillery was not there. He had 1 battery of artillery, so he has almost no artillery, and only 2/3 of his infantry, about 20,000 men, 19 or 20,000 men. Schofield's got 27,000 men in breastworks. Now, if 1 soldier behind breastworks is equal to 3 soldiers in front of the breastworks trying to attack them, how many men would Hood have to defeat Schofield's army? 81,000 men. How many men does Hood actually have? About 20,000. That math doesn't work. That doesn't calculate. Hood's going to try it. We'll do it by our superior elan and our superior determination and whatever. So they formed up. By the time they could get, and this is not speak ill of them. This does not mean that they were not good at what they did or that they were poorly organized. It takes time to get even 20,000 men. That's a lot of people. To get 20,000 men deployed out from the road and formed into line and ready to advance. It was 4 p.m. before the Confederate assault went forward. They had 34 minutes till sunset when they started to advance. So not much daylight left on this short November afternoon. The rays of the sun are already slanting very steeply. They'd be shining from the left of the advancing Confederates. As they start forward, Confederate bands strike up Dixie and the Bonnie Blue flag. Confederate troops cheer. 20,000 men advancing. That's almost twice the number who advanced in Pickett's charge. They're advancing almost twice as far across an open plain. Now, that does not mean that they're going to get killed twice as far away, because the really effective killing zone is only about 400 yards deep. the real slaughter starts 400 yards out. So in that sense, it's not different than Pickett's charge. But in sense of the spectacle presented of 20,000 men advancing while bands play Bonnie Blue Flag and the Confederate soldiers cheer, it was an amazing thing. And they almost broke the Union line anyway because of a mistake that a Union commander made. The last Union division commander to come into the position, to come up the pike over Winstead Hill and then to the Union position, was General Wagner. And some people said he was drunk too, but I don't know that we really have evidence for that. So I think Hood was not high and Wagner was probably not drunk, but he made a mistake, and that is he had orders to stay on Winstead Hill and hold that against Hood, unless Hood, pushed him, gave him a serious push, and then he was to fall back. Just, in other words, don't let the rebels have Winstead Hill just for free. Make them push you off it. Wagner didn't understand. He stopped his men halfway across the plain, the flat plain between Winstead Hill and the Union position. This was the worst possible place to put them. They couldn't possibly hold that position. They would be swamped. They would be overrun on both flanks. And Wagner ordered them to take position there. And so they did, two of the brigades. But one of the brigade was commanded by a Brigadier General Emerson Opdyke, and he just said no. And in blatant disobedience of orders, he just marched his brigade back into the Union position and halted them right behind the Carter Plantation, the buildings of the Carter Plantation there, the house, the plantation office, the gin house, and so forth. And he just halted them there in a reserve position. He said, I'm not going to get my men slaughtered because General Wagner doesn't understand his business. Well, sure enough, as the Confederates advanced, General Cleburne's division, Brigadier General Granbury's brigade were advancing directly toward those Union troops, as well as General Brown's division to the left of Cleburne's. And they hit them there, and they swamped them. They went around hit them in front with overwhelming force and went around them on both flanks. Those Union troops didn't have any breastworks. They didn't have any entrenchments, and they were just swept away. Many were captured. Others ran for their lives to get back to the Union works. As he saw the Union troops begin to run, General Cleburne called out, follow them into the works. See, with all those Union troops running away, their comrades on the line would not be able to fire for fear of hitting their own men. Now, maybe they really, should have just done it because you have to win the battle, but they're not going to do it. That's asking a lot, and that's really cold and hard. You shoot and you might hit your own men, so they're not going to do it. And the Confederates are right mixed all in with them. So you've got this just running mass of the Union troops, and then a couple steps behind you've got the Confederates. Cleburne's there on horseback at first. He had a couple of, I forget how many horses he had shot out from under him. Finally, he doesn't have a horse, and he proceeds on foot. Granbury is there too. I don't know if he's still on horseback or not. I think his horse was shot out from under him. He's advancing on foot, and brigade commanders often did anyway. And they close in. They've got a chance now to break the Union line. It just happened that where the Columbia Pike went through the Union line, that was a weak spot. And now they're headed right for that spot with a bunch of Yankees in front of them running as human shields. It's just the perfect setup. And they hit the Union line and they go right through it. Well, by that time, Cleburne's not there anymore. He was fatally shot some yards short of the Union lines. Granbury's not there anymore either. They found his body also well short of the Union line. Both of them were killed before they crossed the line. But their troops broke through, or were sort of in the process of breaking through, around the Carter House and the Carter Plantation buildings. And furious fighting raged in the yard of the Carter House and the outbuildings around it. And you can go to Franklin today and see them, and you can still see they're just pockmarked with bullet holes from the fighting that raged there. Opdyke, whose brigade had been in reserve, now turned out to have done exactly the right thing. That's exactly what the Union needed there. It was a reserve brigade exactly there. He puts his guys in. His corps commander comes up and says, I didn't even have to give any orders. Opdyke was doing exactly the right thing. And they had an intense hand-to-hand battle there in the yard of the Carter House, bayoneting each other, swinging musket butts if they didn't have time to put on their bayonet. or even just punching each other, whatever they could, just fighting desperately for their lives. They were able to drive the Confederates back to the breastworks. Now, the Confederates were on one side of the breastworks in the ditch. The Union troops were on the other side of the breastworks, and there they fought. And hours went by. Of course, nightfall follows most of the fighting. Now, the next several hours, it's fighting in the dark. They said, one soldier said, I had often heard it said that in battle of seeing blood running like a branch, because that's what you say in Georgia for a creek. And he said, blood running like a branch, but he said, this time I actually saw it in the ditch. So many men were killed that there were bodies on top of bodies. It was a gruesome, gruesome scene, but they couldn't break through. Elsewhere all along the line, of course, that's not the only place the attack took place. That's where Claiborne attacked, that's where Granbury attacked, and their men. The Texans attacked there. That's where the almost breakthrough happened, the momentary breakthrough. But all along the rest of the line, the rest of the Army of Tennessee, those 20,000 men were attacking, but they didn't even have as much success as that. They didn't have any Yankees running ahead of them for human shields. They didn't hit a weak spot in the line, and they were simply mowed down. As late as 9 o'clock, when one of the other divisions from the rest of his remaining corps came up, Hood actually ordered them into the battle. They were actually not able to get into the battle because it was dark by then and they couldn't find the Union lines. They couldn't fire blindly because they knew they had Confederate friendly troops in front of them. The battle finally sort of winked out around 10 o'clock or so, after several hours. In all, it had lasted about 5 hours. The result was 6,200 Confederate casualties out of about 20,000 men who actually got into the fight, maybe a little less than that. So about a third of all the Confederates who went into the fight became casualties. Now, of those 6,200, about 1,700, maybe 1,750 were just killed outright, dead on the field of battle. And the rest were wounded or missing. Among the dead were 6 Confederate generals, aside from General Claiborne and General Granbury. There was General John Adams and General States Rights Gist and General Brown and General Carter, several Confederate generals. That really hurt. 55 different regimental commanders were killed or wounded. I should say 7 other Confederate generals were wounded. That's 6 dead, 7 wounded, and 1 captured. So they lost 14 generals. Now, how many generals actually went into battle? Well, there would have been about 24. 24 generals would have advanced. 14 of them were put out of action, either killed, wounded, or captured. So the majority of their generals were lost. Again, a lot of leading from the front to inspire the men to do this incredible thing. And again, 55 regimental commanders. I'm not sure the actual number of regiments, but that would have been more than half. That would have been more than half the total number of regiments. So it was a disaster. During the night, Schofield did what he had been wanting to do anyway. What was that? Pull out across the Harpeth River and march back to Nashville. And the next morning, the Confederates got up and they had the town of Franklin. It was all theirs, but at what cost? How many men had Schofield lost in all that intense hand-to-hand fighting around the gin house there in the Carter House? About 2,000 killed, wounded, and captured. So about a third of what Hood did. It had been very lopsided, one of the most lopsided battles of the war. Hood's Army of Tennessee was in many ways wrecked. Now it still has, a lot of soldiers left, but the loss of leadership was devastating. For example, Granbury's Texas Brigade never really was very effective after this. Once Granbury was removed, they really needed his leadership. And they really lost a lot of their effectiveness when they lost him. Other units the same. And so the Army of Tennessee, Hood's Army, really was not annihilated. It didn't cease to exist, but it was really wrecked, and its fighting power was largely blunted there at Franklin. A bad miscalculation. One final story. I know I've talked a long time, and I thank you for your patience, but one final story before I go. I mentioned the Carter house. The Carter's middle child, Todd Carter was a Confederate soldier. He was a Confederate officer, I think a lieutenant. And he had enlisted, I believe, 3 years earlier when the war started. And he hadn't been home, he hadn't had to leave. He'd been away in the Army the whole time. And he was with Hood's Army. So when they charged across that open space towards the Carter house, Todd Carter was coming home for the first time in 3 years. Well, they found him still alive, just a couple of 100 yards from his house where he'd been born and where he grew up. His family found him the next morning. They carried him into the house, but and put him in a bed. According to one story, and I don't know if this is really true or not, but one story that's told is he was in the same bed in the same room, or another story says the same bed but another room, anyway, where he was born. But it was certainly the house in which he was born, that's for sure. But he died a day or so later. I think it was 1 or 2 days later. So one of the very poignant stories of Franklin, and how sad that all was. Well, I guess that's my signal that I really am done. I was finishing it up, honestly and truly, but I guess I have talked long enough. Well, okay. Well, that was the Battle of Franklin then. Largely broke the Army of the Tennessee. It was largely the Confederacy's last hurrah in the West. I thank you all for your attention and your patience.